sketching y squared. So this is very similar to sketching a square root function, because what we have is, if we're given a graph y equals f of x, we want to sketch y squared equals f of x. And y squared equals f of x, we just make y the subject, and we get plus or minus the square root of f of x. And all this means is, when we're sketching y squared equals f of x, all we need to do is sketch the square root of f of x and reflect it about the x-axis. So all the same rules still apply for the square root of f of x, but once we finish that, we just reflect it with the x-axis. And let's have a look at an example. Let's look at if we have y equals 2x. We're going to want to sketch the y squared function. Y squared of f of x. So let's draw in our xy axis, and let's sketch y equals 2x, which is going to be something like that. And let's make note of a few points. So this y value is 0, and the square root of 0 is still 0. Somewhere along here we have a y value of 1. Let's say, a y value of 1. So wherever the y value of 1 is, say about here. Just get rid of this. And the square root of 1 is also 1. So we know our square root function is also cutting there. All of these values of y are less than 1, which means our square root function needs to be above the graph there. And all of these values of y are greater than 1, so our square root function needs to be below those values. So we get something like that. And because this is a y squared function, we have our minus case, which means all we need to do is reflect everything we've drawn so far about the x-axis, and we get something like this. Let's have a look at another example. Y equals cos x. And then we want to graph y squared, which will just be y squared equals cos x. So let's analyze what's going on for just y equals cos x first. So we know cos x starts up at 1 and is periodic and keeps going forever and ever. And we can show up to 2 pi and minus 2 pi. Now, looking at the square root, because remember our y graph is just plus or minus the square root of cos x. So whenever we have a 0 value, we know that our square root function is also cutting there. And whenever we have 1, our square root function is cutting there. So we know the graph cuts at all of these points as well, because the square root of 0 is still 0, and the square root of 1 is still 1. Now, all of these values are in between 0 and 1, which means the square root of those values is bigger. So we know our graph is doing something like that. All these y values are negative, so we can't square root negative values. All of these values are in between 0 and 1, so our curve needs to be above. And same thing over here, and same thing over here. And finally, because we're dealing with a plus or minus square root, everything needs to be reflected about the x-axis. So we end up with these odd-looking circles.